In 1968, as near as we can date it now, Christmas of 68, I had gone off to graduate school in 67, and I was cut off from all the wargamers, and I was missing what's going on. So I'm coming home on vacations and stuff, and I have endless amounts of time to imagine more complicated scenarios I could do if I come back.
And David Wesely showed up. He comes down the stairs, and that's when I first sort of became aware of Wesely. He'd been this sort of a in and out character in Arneson's basement because of his military activity.
Dave Wesely being interested in tactics and strategy, and he's a captain in the military and he's about to be activated. He's starting to take an interest in these higher level games with multiple players.
And so I evolved this convoluted business I was going to run where instead of having just two sides in a battle, I was going to have, everybody was going to have their own objectives.
Most games are two-sided. Player A, player B, one person wins. But in these games, you have player A, B, C, D, but they're not necessarily opposed. And sometimes they have cooperative goals.
Well, I set up a battle around a mythical town in Germany at the beginning of a French-German conflict in the Napoleonic Wars.
A couple of interesting things occurred during that same period, and these were single-day events that Dave Wesely or Dave Arneson were involved in, where each of us played a role of being part of a large situation.
So I create all these different conflicts between different people. Huge set. Now I had about 8 different roles in mind. I planned on having about 8 people.
And I remember in the Braunstein game, lasted all day Saturday from 9 till 9 or midnight.
I set this thing up. 22 people came over to Wesley's for the game that he was going to put on when he came back from college. Not 8.
You know, with the Arneson crowd, it was very much revolved around the game. We were the emperors and presidents and generals and stuff like that, and we had our armies, and we got to sort of interact with each other on that level.
Strategos reappeared in the group in this interval.
And the other part was that Wesely would be coming in occasionally with these other ideas, you know, the Braunsteins, and that just sort of added a whole flavor.
Because Strategos said you were going to have a referee who ran the game. And he made all the calls on anything that was argued about. He could settle it.
And so that's when we would all get together and sort of, you know, realize that we were all part of a bigger group. And I think that realization was what helped make us a more cohesive group.
So we did that for a while, and indeed it worked really good. Once we got it established that so-and-so is a referee, now he just settles everything, right?
And so when we went away from a Braunstein, now when we went back into the basement, there's a bigger understanding of you know, our relationship to everybody else that was playing there.
That's where Dave Arneson moved to the fore, because we found that there were about 4 of us who would have a good feel for the flow of the game and who could run a game and have everybody accept that his refereeing wasn't just being snotty to them, and that he knew what he was talking about, or at least he sounded convincing. And Arneson, with his meticulous historical research all the time, really did bolster that position.
Dave Arneson and Dave Wesely, because of their really vast knowledge of military history and history in general and their background, Dave Wesely being in the military and Dave Arneson having majored in Napoleonic history, they were really setting the pace, and they were the ones that we looked to create this world and these situations, because they had the background and the knowledge to do it a lot more easily than everyone else. So they were organizing games and trying out new ideas and that sort of thing.
So David emerged as a major leader within the group because he would undertake the odious job of being the referee. And then he'd do a good job, and people became confident with him, and which meant they wanted him to referee again and again and again and again.
You know, Dad was a very introverted guy. He had a way to remember people's natures and people's interests, and he could weave this tale. It almost seemed like out of thin air.
Dave Arneson is an interesting guy. Dave was probably the kindest, gentlest, sweetest, most mild-mannered person I have ever known, until he sat down opposite you at the war game table, whereupon the skin would split off his head to reveal a bloody skull with flames coming out of the eyes, and he would plunge his hand into your chest, rip out your heart, wave it under your nose, and eat it in front of you, laughing maniacally the entire time.
He was very charismatic and very gregarious in that domain.
He was the Imperial Grand Judge and Master of the room. You know, he was the referee. He had some little patience if you were just indecisive.
He came alive when it came time to run the campaign and encourage people to play.
He quickly learned that, you know, he didn't have a lot of time to have people fumbling around with the indecisiveness of what to do. He wanted the games, the miniature games, to move along.
I mean, people loved it when he was the dungeon master, and it came so natural to him.
I've never met a more ruthless player who, off of the table, was such an overwhelmingly sweet guy.
Dave Arneson was born in Hennepin County, Minnesota, to his parents, Bob and Maxine Arneson. And he grew up in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area.
He was an only child, as I was, and that gives you a little different perspective on things than if you had a lot of brothers and sisters. For one thing, it gives you the opportunity to take over the whole basement for you and your friends anytime you want to.
Dave had a love for history, especially the history of battles. And his parents really fostered that love. They took him to national parks, and they bought him books.
But there was some strain between David and his parents. His father had been a Marine in the Second World War, and David was this fat, chubby kid who was clearly not going to be a Marine.
He was in the Boy Scouts. He loved history. He collected maps and pored over them. When he would get a magazine like a National Geographic with a battlefield map or a map of some country, he would pore over it and imagine whatever battles had taken place in history there.
I think, well, I know from various evidence that his parents, by and large, had given him to understand he was quite a disappointment.
And slowly over time, he decided that his real interest was in warfare. And the Civil War and Napoleonics became of a special interest to him.
And yet, I have to say that I never saw his parents ever berate him or something. They weren't grotesque about this, but you could feel there was this undercurrent of not going any place with life, just goofing off.
Knowing Dave's love for history of battles in the Civil War, his parents come across a game, Avalon Hill's Gettysburg.
This was 1963, 1964, and this is a whole new thing, board games on historical topics.
With Gettysburg, Dave now realizes that there's a whole nother world of reliving these battlefields. No longer does he have to live out these battlefields in his mind's eye. Instead, he can actually reenact them on small scale.
He loved reading, he loved history. He wasn't interested in sports. He wasn't interested in going to the bars. You know, typical status quo just wasn't his nature.
And he has dozens of Civil War, American Civil War soldiers and 54 millimeter military figures. And I imagine that he played out many, many battles with these toys during his childhood. But once he gets Gettysburg, then he realizes that the scope of what he can recreate is much greater.
But he still found a way to find his passion and follow that. And in the process, met some guys who felt similar and was able to build friendships with them that lasted, 40 years.
You knew all these people. I mean, Gaylord and Wesely and Arneson, and they were all part of the group. You all knew everybody, and we were all the same age, pretty much.
He is also involved in several clubs, his own MMSA, the Midwest Military Simulations Association, which is his group of high school friends and their fathers and the older figures who founded the club.
Because he and Wesely were organizing this campaign, this Napoleonic campaign. It was kind of fun to be able to play these games, and he was setting them up. And that's the way all the gaming groups I've ever been in, have somebody like that. Somebody that kind of organizes it and gets it going. And Arneson was the organizer.
They were very interested in tabletop miniature gaming, fighting out historical battles, not as a board game with cardboard pieces, but actual miniature figures which were painted up to represent armies and battalions and that sort of thing. So you could fight battles from history, or you could run your own campaigns, which they did.
1966, in June, Dave graduates from Highland Park High School, and after he graduates, he decides to go to Hamlin Junior College and take some courses to get himself ready for college.
They sent him off to college then as the year went by, and that they were disappointed that he didn't become something worthwhile. He went off to college, private college, Hamlin University, where I went, and then he transferred to the University of Minnesota, which I think was because he was having too much fun playing war games and not enough getting good grades.
In addition to being a full-time college student at the University of Minnesota, Dave is also working part-time as a security guard for Midwest Patrol, a security company that works in and around the Minneapolis-St. Paul area.
It was a whole rich milieu of possible gaming situation, and for anybody who loves history and loves those other eras, it was a great opportunity to not only learn but to enjoy games, in those situations.
Dave was also working at the Midway at the Minnesota State Fair. He was selling tickets and earned a little extra money. He had been doing this since late in high school and all the way through his college years.
He went off to the University of Minnesota, where he majored in history, which is only going to be a big money maker for you if you're a PhD. And then he spent all his hours, hour after hour, when he should have been studying. He's going around these games.
Very early on at the University of Minnesota, Dave joined ROTC.
And the difference was at that time frame, there were a lot of guys in college who were doing lots worse ways of messing their life up than just playing these silly games, right? He wasn't running anything up his nose during this time frame. And to some degree, I suspect his parents were going, well, at least he's not doing dope.
And it seems like he is gearing up towards a career in the military. And certainly his friends from the MMSA are heading in that direction as well. Dave Wesely would soon be activated for Vietnam, and Dave McGarry had also signed up to be in Vietnam.
I show up for my induction physical, and we're all standing in a line. Then they weigh me. I'm now 116. I lost 4 pounds with all that work, and I'm about 5'10", like I was supposed to be. And it turns out that there's height-weight ratios. If you're below that, they can't accept you. And so there I am. I'm out.
Unfortunately, he, because of a medical condition, was not allowed in, or perhaps fortunately for him.
My grandfather, is the very opposite of that. He grew up in the Depression. So you get one job and you try to stay there as long as you can, and you work your way up through the company, and he's, didn't understand what my dad did. He kept waiting for him to get a real job.
And it was a cool thing to get to know him, because he was a guy who'd been through some awesomely bad stuff. And so I'll give him a lot of credit for not having big problems with his non-military boy in the 1960s. I mean, it wasn't like Arneson was a hippie protester or something, which probably would have got his dad bent out of shape. But he was clearly, he was never going to pass a physical and get in the Army, right?
Dave and I were gaming friends. I was part of his group of gamers in the Twin Cities.
We met a fellow by the name of Mike Carr. And Mike Carr was playing a World War II game. They were a set of rules, World War II in miniature by Michael F. Corns.
And that was paralleled too by another gaming system called Fight in the Skies, which was Mike Carr's World War I air combat game.
The Blue Max is the first one. The protagonist, Bruno Stockel, is the young man in that book who goes on from the Army, modest beginnings, to become a flyer and become an ace. So the Hollywood movie is completely different than the novel, which is pretty interesting in itself. But the aerial scenes are just stirring and amazing. And as a teenager, I was just enamored of that era and those airplanes, the biplanes, and the aerial battles, the first dogfights.
He had devolved a process where you wanted to try flying all the different airplanes, but of course, no one pilot could have done that because they're from different countries.
As somebody who liked gaming and historical gaming, wouldn't it be neat if you could have a game where you could get that same feel of the dogfight and that sort of thing, which is depicted in the movie? So that movie literally inspired me to design this game.
So you wound up having a little stable of 3x5 cards where you had your German pilot and your French pilot and so on, and if you got killed, and as you went through your missions and you were successful, your skill level went up.
You got to play an individual soldier actually fighting. They would lay out a bunch of buildings and so on, and you'd actually wander around in the buildings and hide behind the little trees and so on. You explain this to a referee.
And if you got killed, you really missed it because you had this guy through 15 different games now, and it's, he's just getting really built up. They're going to finally promote him to colonel, and now he gets killed. That sounds like a little Dungeons and Dragons thing, doesn't it, right?
And Arneson did the referee. We would come in and he would explain what we'd see, what we'd hear, if somebody had gave us a report or whatever, and then he would ask us what we were going to do.
That idea of having characters who improve with time and experience and keeping records on them sort of morphed its way over into our Napoleonic games, to where we began to keep track of the various colonels commanding different battalions or generals or whatever, and you're noting down whether they get killed during a cavalry charge, and if not, did they get a wound, did they have a scar, all kinds of junk like that's going on. It's all fleshing out the history. But you can see the resemblance to what will come, right?
It was different in a way, but the same because of the referee. Because that's exactly how the Corns works, is we were doing the same kind of movement. Would come in and they'd give us a situation, then we'd do something. But that was just combat. This was actually role-playing. We were actually doing things.
Dave makes his way through several semesters of college at the University of Minnesota, and he is almost done with his degree in history, and his parents have planned a trip to Norway.
Yeah, it was different, but like I say, it was part of the same. It was just an evolution, and we took the next step.
Bob and Maxine were trying to reconnect with the Arneson family there. He was more interested in connecting with the wargaming history of the area. And then eventually, about a week later, he travels over to London.
The other thing that went on was that the referee is the one who will come up with the scenario for the battle they're going to do.
Dave gets a little bit of freedom, and he ends up sneaking over to the Tradition game shop. And Tradition is a miniatures warfare shop.
One of the things about the refereed war games, which preceded the role-playing games, was that you willingly subordinated yourself to the dictatorial powers of this referee.
So it was a real treat for Dave to be in and amongst all of these old miniatures and just vast supplies of them. But still, Dave explores around, he tinkers around, he goes to the upstairs, and he finds a curious bin.
And there were some people who wouldn't go for that within the group. They drifted off. But for the most part, because it made the game flow smoothly, and because you got this good interaction in the game, the battle would proceed nicely, they'd put up with the fact that there'd be this referee who would sometimes thwart you by telling you, oh, you can't do that. I mean, it's too bad. If the stream's too deep, you can't cross there with your cavalry, right? And then, of course, that becomes more elaborate when you get into the role-playing games.
And in it are these icosahedrons, 20-sided dice, as they're now commonly called. And he had never seen anything like this before, but Dave immediately grasps their application to wargaming.
Now there's another one which is rather critical, and that is rolling dice.
Dave comes back from his European trip with his parents, 20-sided dice in hand, shows them to his gaming group, and he says that thought they were an interesting curiosity, but they were a little impractical because they only had 2.
We had thought it was just natural to roll dice. Avalon Hill Games did it, and Totten uses dice. And there was this whole debate about whether dice and chance have any place in the game.
After his European tour, Dave still has to finish the credits he needs to complete his degree.
One of the things that happens, Arneson goes from a, I'm the ref, you tell me and I decide plan into a you get to roll the dice to decide it.
And so he takes another semester or finishes his last semester at the University of Minnesota and eventually graduates with his degree in 1971.
The referee is now off the hook. And that's a very important aspect of the structuring that then takes place.
So Napoleonic campaign was devised by Dave Arneson, where we would start at some arbitrary date, say 1800 in the middle of that period, and each of us as participants was in charge of one country, and some of the large countries like Russia might have 2 players, England might have 2 players, France might have 2 players for the Army and Navy and so on. And across the map of Europe, we used diplomacy to move armies and fleets, and then when they would come into conflict with each other, we could fight that out as naval battle or on a tabletop battle with miniature figurines.
So pretty soon you found that being the referee wasn't the thankless task that it could have been. Because now you make up the scenario, and you make up the amusing anecdote events that happen.
Behind the scenes, prior to that, we were given national budgets to reflect the wealth of these countries, which then, as the commander of the country or the king or whatever, we would spend to equip armies and build naval ships, equip armies, train them better, get better equipment, more horses or whatever. Of course, cavalry is expensive, ships are expensive, so you got to kind of decide. And keep in mind, this was all in the age before computers. So here's Dave Arneson, who dreamed this up, and he's running this thing in endless hours, weekly, and we're all doing this on paper.
And so you no longer just have a battery of guns dashes forward and limbers here to open fire upon the gates of the town. No, now it gets enlivened with Lieutenant, make up a name, has taken it up there, and they're firing, and you roll some dice, and you roll some dice, and guy, he's still standing, he gets another shot off, that kind of a play-by-play of totally imaginary play-by-play that's really just interpreting the you rolled a 6 and you rolled a 5, so you win.
I got to the point where they're calling him on the phone because we sort of realized that we physically did not have to be there. We could just have a dialogue, and then you could be writing your little map, and he could be rolling the dice, and you don't need to be physically present.
And the guys ate it up. So we were into that sort of not role-playing, but storytelling.
We're filling out our budgets, and off the price sheet, we're buying regiments and ships and frigates and ships of line, and we're submitting to him. He's looking it all over. We assemble these fleets, then we order them around, and we come into battles and we play them out. So it's just mind-boggling to think of the amount of paperwork and all of the richness of this that Dave was pretty much single-handedly running.
We'd gone from having sort of a storytelling version of miniature war games to having a multi-sided, individual players have their individual objectives game in which you actually play some character other than you're just a general or a colonel or whatever. And we've evolved from having just kind of for the fun of it backstories on our stray generals or whatever into having it become an essential part of your objectives in the game. So these are being fleshed out characters, and you're going to be playing one of these people.
I played Kar Pasha, the head of the Barbary pirates, the Barbary coast of Africa, who were a hazard to navigation and commerce in those days. And it was my job to find allies, and of course we were in proximity to Spain, so we had to steer clear of the Spanish Navy. but we had not an alliance, but a good arrangement with the Kingdom of France.
So he's playing Napoleonics with Dave Wesely and several others of their group. And at one point, the two opposing armies come to a small town, Braunstein.
I went to University of California at Santa Barbara for 2 years. So I was coming back in the different times. And and a lot of things were changing. Probably the biggest change was Wesely bringing the Braunstein idea into the mix.
The French army is advancing towards the town. French cavalry are going to be getting there tomorrow to see if you can get across the river there. And this cavalry officer rides out ahead of time, slips into the town in the dark, disguises himself to spy out the local defenses. That's one character gets that one.
And they set up a little village called Braunstein in the Napoleonic Wars, and we all took roles as various people in there.
And then he gets this concept that he could make this into a full-fledged game using some of these concepts that he's already picked up from these books. And he starts to apply himself as the neutral referee, setting up the environment, setting up the stage, creating little characters for everybody to play.
Another character, he is rushing down to this town. He's the Prussian Jaeger commander. He's rushing down to this town to defend it because the word is the French are headed that way.
It's up to them to play the characters, and it's up to them to decide how they act in the game.
And then we hit them with people with all these totally unrelated things that are what they're actually going to be doing for the day, which is one of them is the mayor of the town. Another one is the banker. He's got to worry about he's saving his money in his bank. Another one is the university chancellor, university across the river from the other side of the river. And then you have the pro-French radical revolutionary student. You have the pro-Prussian, loyal, dedicated to King of Prussia student. You have the student who just wants to party. You have all these different people getting tavern owners. There was a riot last night with the students. The tavern got wrecked. The militia wrecked it while they were getting the students. Who pays for this? And so I create all these different conflicts between different people.
So this is the very beginning of the Braunsteins, which lead into the first role-playing games as we know them.
And I had a way of conducting the game that turned out to be completely unworkable once the game got rolling, and that like everybody who wanted to talk to each other was supposed to come over to me so I could hear what they had to say to each other and I could rate their performance or something, right?
Role-playing games are already being played. Like I said, the Rand Institute is already doing role-playing games. Psychologists are using role-playing games for helping families cope with tragedy and loss. And these sorts of things are all in existence.
So after early stage where I have briefings for everybody, I'm making them up as I go along.
Yet Wesely, very interested in gaming, very interested in military strategy, taps into this and then turns it into what is essentially a very enjoyable game.
I was in a little side room with the map of the town, and everybody else is out there mingling around and eating snacks and drinking soda and stuff. And not supposed to talk to each other except when they come to see me, right? So, and I have little pieces noting where everybody is in town, right? They move them when they come in. I'm going to hear next. Okay, fine. Well, that didn't hold up.
Much like the diplomacy games, took something that was just supposed to be a board game, and suddenly it becomes a very immersive role-playing experience.
Two guys can walk into me and they say, "Hi, we're going to have a duel. How do we do a duel?" And I said, "What do you mean you're having a duel?" And he said, "Well, he challenged me to a duel, and he's just a stupid student, and I'm a Prussian army colonel, and I can't let that go. We're going to fight."
The day-long games that we played, Braunstein and Brownstone, even more of a personal participation in a role-playing situation. So this is kind of evolving and expanding as it goes along.
I said, "Well, okay. Wait a minute. He's supposed to be at the university. You're supposed to be downtown." "No, he moved over to see me." Right. Obviously, you're not listening to me, right? So I said, "Okay, you're going to roll 3d6, you're going to roll 2d6, right? And the difference in score is the win." And the guy, I said, "Wait a minute, I'm supposed to be the head of the fencing club. I should be better than that." And I said, No. He's a real serving military officer who's had dozens of duels in his life and really killed people. You always fight with a phony sword. Good luck."
And so, again, a fascinating sort of thing where we got exposure to role-playing in a really fun situation, where you kind of had to figure out things yourself based on what the judge told you and interact with the other players to try to figure out if you're going to work together and what are you going to try to accomplish, and then present that to the judge, and it got played out, sometimes with dice rolling.
Well, the colonel ran this poor kid right through. I mean, it's like he rolled a 9, they rolled a 15 and the other guy rolled a 4. So it's bap, it's over, right? No, that's it, you're dead, man, your character's gone. I'm thinking you shouldn't have played around and messed up with me, and you're not supposed to talk to each other either, so there, right? So I just killed him off. Well, that was Dave Arneson who just got killed.
And of course, you try to diplomatically talk people into going your way before going to fisticuffs or, you know, resorting to gunplay and that sort of thing.
Finally, at 2 o'clock in the morning, I called everybody back in and I said, guys, I'm sorry, this completely fell apart. I can't tell you who won the game. I got no idea. Well, Arneson didn't because he's dead. But aside from that, I can't tell you who won the game. It's been a stinking disaster. I'm sorry I did this. And they said, oh, no, we had a great time. We had a great time.
So with the Braunsteins and diplomacy, we see this idea of having a single platform that can use multiple genres.
The next vacation, I came home and Arneson saying, what are you going to do in nothing was games? And I said, what do you mean? It's that Braunstein game, everybody loved it. I thought, holy mackerel, that was better than I thought it was.
So we see a pattern with the Braunsteins being run by Dave Wesely and later Dwayne Jenkins and Dave Arneson. We see it starts as Braunstein for a Napoleonics campaign.
We did one that was set in a banana republic, and that was kind of fun.
And that was a coup d'etat in a fictional banana republic, backwater, Latin American location where we each had a role to play.
And Arneson, I went over to Arneson's house one day. We were going to do it like on Saturday, and I'm over at his house Wednesday. And he said, say, Dave, I've prepared a few things I'd like to use in the game. And I said, oh? And he said, yeah. And he pulls out, and he had 13 various forged documents. One of which says he's from the CIA, one of which says he's on a special mission for El Jefe de Presidente, another one that anybody should cooperate with him, we gave him assistance, right? Another one is, oh gosh, I don't remember, there was just this long list of useful fake documents to come up with it.
I played the commander of the Air Force of this fictional country. And the Air Force consisted of a helicopter. And other people played the mayor of the capital city. There was the El Presidente who had been deposed or was trying to hold on to power. There was the army commander and the press, the newspaper publisher, the radio station guy, and there was just a lot of diplomacy going on.
And I looked at it and said, this is going to totally unbalance the game. Arneson's got this fairly wimpy character who scores points easily because he's a non-violent resistance group that wants to spread leaflets around town to prove, to undermine the government, right? And now he's going to have this treasure trove of goodies to play with.
We didn't really know what was happening, but we had to form an alliance and try to make sense of this developing coup d'etat and who was going to come out on top and that sort of thing. It was a fascinating situation.
I won't go through all the ins and outs of the game, but in the end, he has been handed the secret incriminating dossiers on 3 of the people, other people in the game that he can use to guarantee that they can't win. He has been given $1 million from the Treasury Department in their country.
And then it becomes Brownstone, run by Dwayne Jenkins, and it's a Western theme.
And the setting was a Wild West town called Brownstone, kind of a take off on the Braunstein sort of thing.
And he walks across the plaza, and there's an Army helicopter sitting there with its rotor blades turning, and he walks over to it and he says, here's my letter from El Jefe, I'm on a special mission, you've got to give me a ride. The helicopter pilot says, sure, and he takes off, and he flies across the city to go out of the country with his $1 million that he didn't have coming, right? He remembers he's still got his 1,000 propaganda leaflets to distribute, and he throws them out of the door one after the other as they fly across the city and scatters them all over the city.
I was the Reverend Dwayne DeTruth, and unbeknownst to the other players, I was a former gunfighter who had gone straight, And there were the ranchers and the railroad people and the sheriff and the outlaws on the edge of town, the banker, the mayor, and et cetera. And so we all had this day-long interaction trying to accomplish different things.
So I sat the guys down at the end and I said, okay, now I'm going to work the scoring. And I did the end of game scoring as I planned it. And they all agreed Arneson definitely won the game. It was hands down. He went out there in places we never expected he was going to.
And then, all of a sudden, Dave Wesely, who is a captain in the military, gets called to active duty and has to leave late in 1970.
When Arneson said, can I run them after you're gone? Because I'm going off to the Army. And right at that time, I was just terribly concerned with the fact that I was probably going to go off to Vietnam and get killed.
And so Dave runs the Braunsteins and he runs various versions of them. But now we come to the point where you see that we have a few variations. We have the Brownstone, we have Anaban, the Banana Republic.
I mean, it was not a rational view because, well, frankly, they didn't actually send me to Vietnam once I got in the Army. So I left, and then I got some letters from Dave, and all of a sudden he's got elves and dwarves and stuff, right?
Dave has time to tinker, right? And to think and imagine, and you know, he describes that scene of eating popcorn and having just read a Conan novel and watching the creature feature on the local Saturday TV show.
Inevitably on the weekends he'd be watching his favorite movies, which he thought were funnier than all hell, which were the Japanese horror flicks, Godzilla and the flying turtle with Gamera and all that. So he was laughing his ass off with it.
And then he comes up with this concept of a Braunstein set in a fantasy medieval world like Conan or like Dark Shadows.
Now, Jenkins also loved this Dark Shadows. And I thought it was damn near the dumbest thing I ever heard. This stupid soap opera about a vampire and a ghost. And I said, oh, God, this is dumber than crap.
And that is the beginning of the kernels of the idea that there could be a fantasy Braunstein. And so that's what eventually becomes Blackmoor.
When Arneson moved into a fantasy world, he got an even bigger advantage because there you can make the world work the way that works good for the rules. You don't have to get into complications about, yeah, but you couldn't just shoot the guy on the spot, you'd have to arrest him.
Fantasy is, because there's fewer physical limits, is much more wide open, and I think that's why fantasy became by far the most popular form of role-playing, because the element of magic alone adds an extra dimension.
He has essentially taken the world of J.R.R. Tolkien, which was, by the way, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings was the big book for us to read when we were college students. About the time I was a sophomore, that was like the in-book to have read.
And he has these players as themselves explore Castle Blackmoor, a sort of haunted castle with vampire vines that latch onto you and drain your blood.
And you could set up an adventure in that background, and they would be able to tap into what they remembered from the books and wouldn't have to have every last detail explained to them.
And I come back home, and Jenkins is telling me about going down into this dungeon and doing this stuff with Arneson in the castle. And he says, yeah, and there's a vampire. And I said, oh, God, this is dumb.
But the decision to put it into a fantasy environment as opposed to trying to do Richard the Lionheart, the medieval role-playing game, right, where suddenly you get into real questions like how far can you shoot a longbow that really, like, there's an actual answer for, So that was a big step forward on getting anything to work well.
When they first played this, the players enjoyed the experience, but they were a little too timid because they were actually playing themselves in a fantasy world, and they were a little more guarded. So the real innovation came when they played a persona that they couldn't directly associate risk with, and thus was created the idea of the character that was similar to you, but had traits that were much braver or much more riskier.
And by the time I came back down again, there was a whole group of them playing this thing. I thought, man, so what? Who cares about this stuff?
The Blackmoor campaign that Dave Arneson created and was running using fantasy rules, which were very much evolving from ideas to reality to rules, was something that I got involved in, and I became the first cleric player.
So Arneson had started doing this, and I came home on leave, and I'd been in the Army like a year by that, maybe longer. I'm a first lieutenant, then a leader of men. And I go down to Arneson's basement, and he has the same table we played the Napoleonic miniatures games on, but he's got a castle, and he's got a bunch of little medieval lead miniatures, and he's got some dinosaur figures to be dragons and stuff.
So I have the claim of fame to being the first cleric, and I had a pretty small church, and I had minimal clerical powers. Clerics can wield considerable power, especially to heal. But I was a pretty low-level guy to start out. I had no particular savvy. It was pretty rudimentary.
And he's gaming on that, and I looked at that, and I got in, and I said to myself, well, I'll play it because my friends are playing it, but this is so silly, I'm never going to tell anybody I did this.
And we had dwarf characters and elf characters and fighting men, and of course wizards.
Ross Maker was the first dwarf, as I recall, and people become wizards. Pete Gaylord's the first wizard. Various people got to be the pioneers in a given field.
So it was all very free-form and taking shape through the role-playing sort of thing.
But I came to see that there was actually a lot of fun socializing and gaming going on here, and I got over that initial prejudice.
But we would go on adventures where the dungeon master or the game master, in this case Dave Arneson, would charge us with, here's your mission for today, here's your resources, you know, what do you want to do and how do you want to attempt to accomplish this?
One of the meetings when I was home on leave, where we're gaming, and our party is attacked by, I don't know, trolls. We had trolls came in. So in that era, when you had combat, Arneson said, what are you going to do? And I would say something. Well, I pull out my big two-handed sword, because I was a barbarian superhero, right? I pull out my big two-handed sword, and I whack him right across the backside of the left knee. That'll bring him down. And
can kind of turn us loose. What do you want to do? All right, how many, you know, what resources do we have? We need to buy some rope. We're going to go in a dungeon. We need torches. We've got to equip ourselves, which is part of the fun of the game. And you know, with this limited set of resources and different abilities among these different characters, we had to kind of decide how are we going to tackle this task set to us by the game master.
And so when he comes around to me, he says, okay, you take a mighty whack in him with your sword, and of course it shatters because, you know, trolls are made out of stone. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. The last time we did this, I was up against a troll, and I found that hamstringing him was a really good move. It worked fine a couple of weeks ago. Why doesn't it work now? He said, well, I decided the trolls are going to be made out of stone. Just hang on here, right? So we got into some significant argument about this precise interpretation.
So the game master is presenting you with these sorts of things as you go on your adventure, and there's obstacles on the way to whatever you're trying to accomplish. So part of the fun of it is try to figure out what you got and how you can deal with it, how you can work together as a team to defeat whether it's a puzzle or a monster that's in front of you or some situation that you just don't have a clue. You know, put your heads together and try to figure it out. And that's the fun of role-playing, you know, put yourself in that role.
I made the point that, listen, it's one thing to say that as a barbarian sword swinger, I should know something about martial arts, and it shouldn't just be, whoop, too bad, that's an impossible combination to defeat. No, that's not right.
Dave Arneson, as the game master, had an idea of the framework, which he would hold. And of course, part of the essence of role-playing is you don't tell the players everything.
We need to have this stuff like kind of pre-codified for us. And so his response then was to come back with a copy of Chainmail.
They have access to Chainmail right about this time as well. And Chainmail has the fantasy supplement, which is filled with all sorts of fantastical creatures, and also has magic users or wizards that can cast spells, fireballs, and lightning bolts. There's trolls, and there are heroes and superheroes, and there are elves, and there's all of these elements in the chainmail game.
The game master has an idea, and it kind of lets things go in the direction that they're going to go, that the players want to take them, within certain parameters, of course. So did he know the outcome? No. Could we accomplish what we set out to do? Maybe, maybe not. And that's the essence of the game, and the fun of it is trying to figure out. And you don't always succeed, and that's part of the lesson, is you maybe got to try a second time, or you got to go back and get more resources.
When he said, look, I looked at this, and it's this fantasy, this medieval combat thing, and that'll take care of your objection. We're going to use these rules to do the hand-to-hand combat thing. Oh, yeah, okay, fine. Now I can read, I can bone up on it.
Dave incorporates this new material into his game and even adopts some of the mechanical rules, like the combat system.
It was very bare bones, paper and pencil, and the chainmail rules as a basic for combat.
Ultimately, they would find they didn't really like that combat system, but I would say that the fantastical elements of that stuck with the game. And the use of wizards and the use of superheroes and heroes, those all started becoming part of the regular Blackmoor campaign.
So he starts codifying things, and this gets intricate problems of having to keep track of all of his various decisions, and he winds up like a bushel basket full of scribbled notes on everything he's ever ruled on and how it was interpreted, and it becomes unmanageable again. But that was an evolutionary pass in it.
And you can tell from the trolls and the wizards and the fireballs, those are all stuff from chainmail that have been reincorporated to the game, and it becomes them playing characters, not themselves anymore, and it starts to look more and more like a fantasy adventure or like Dungeons and Dragons.
By that point, I'd gotten over my initial, oh, this is just childish thing, right? And he's playing it, and it's running along nicely, and it's differently set up from what I had with one of my emphases had been multiple objectives, that everybody has his own axe to grind. And in Dungeons and Dragons, he hit on something which was, again, more satisfying, I think, socially as a gaming thing. He came up with a cooperative game.
So now you have Blackmoor running regularly, and Dave Arneson has this percolation of ideas going on in his game, combining the role-playing elements from the Braunsteins, from Dave Wesely, and then he's being influenced by Gary Gygax's chainmail, and it's all coming together into being something very special and something very different.
And all of us adapted quite readily to it, which would seem to think that we'd already played it, and we hadn't in our experience. But yet, as a group of gamers, we hadn't. But as individuals, we already had at different times in our lives, and that was in the play of childhood.
So the original Braunstein path, with everybody's on their own track, kind of got lost with everybody's a part of a collective group who are contending against the forces of evil around them.
Because it was like a regenesis of childhood play, except with specific systemic changes that had been integrated into it by Arneson, by bringing in hard, fast rules and describing laws that were essentially conceptual.
Well, and one of the really unique things about the game is nobody loses. There isn't one declared winner for the participants and other people lose. It's you go through this quest, and how you survive and come out of it. It's this team, it's this unit, it's a family, a band of brothers that goes out on whatever happens. And there just wasn't anything before that, not even counting the realm of magic or the realm of monsters, those factors, but just the literal character development. So, and that's the foundation of what so many games are now about, is character development.
So it's been a very rough year for the Gygax family, and they've scrimped, and they've cut corners. They've been using food stamps to buy their food, and they've been relying on Gary's unemployment for almost a year. But the unemployment money is about to run out. It's September of 1971, and Gary needs to find something.
you lose a lot when you lose a job. Well, if you don't have a lot to begin with, you just start over, so you don't lose, you know. And I just think he worked right through it. I think that's his tenacity, and that showed up in his whole family. And the kids obviously knew there was a change, and we all knew there was a change, but it wasn't something that was, you know, out in the open and being talked about.
As the year comes through, he writes a letter to Dave Arneson, and you find out what really is going on. Clearly, there's not enough money to be had in what he's doing, and he's struggling to keep his dream alive of being a game designer and support his family. And clearly, there is a tension starting to build, and things are starting to come apart at the seams for him. You see in the letter that he writes to Dave, he says, well, things are quite hectic around here. I'm trying to learn the shoe cobbling business, and I'm thinking about getting out of the Castle and Crusade Society altogether.
That letter that Gary sent announcing that he was quitting gaming, wargaming particularly, really had an impact on a lot of people, because I had correspondence with a few other people who mentioned, who Gary had also sent letters to, announcing that, and we were like, well, what do we do?
So as he's struggling through all this, he writes Dave Arneson, who's a friend of his, and says that you know, I just don't know if I can do it all anymore. And it's at this point where he is just about getting ready for Gen Con, and all of this is weighing on his shoulders. And then at Gen Con, something magical happens.